everybody. Welcome to the next installment of the Telephone Talks video series from the Wellington County Museum and Archives. My name is Emily, and today, me and my colleague Katie will be taking a deep dive into the infrastructure of the telephone industry, and we'll be taking a close look at some of the really cool jobs that are involved in the industry as well. So come with us and let's get started. When telephones were first invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1875, one telephone was connected with just one other telephone directly through a telephone line. Eventually, though, people realized that, hey, I want to be able to call more than just one other person with my telephone. I want to be able to call businesses and public services and other households that I want to talk to. And so what they needed was a central telephone exchange facility that would be able to connect them to different destinations with their telephone calls. Widespread telephone lines and cables were needed for them to be able to make these calls. At first, telephone lines were overhead lines that were placed on telephone poles or attached to racks on rooftops and were made of iron or steel. You can see these early telephone poles in this picture here. However, these first telephone lines were very noisy, and eventually bronze and copper steel wires were made to try to decrease noise in the telephone lines. Eventually, there was a large demand for telephone cables to replace the large number of aerial wires that were present in cities. The cables allowed for noise elimination, waterproofing the wires, and fitting more wires in each cable. As you can see here, telephone cables consist of multiple pairs of telephone lines ranging from 6 to 3,600 pairs. The cables were also insulated with paper to help improve voice transmission and decrease muffled, hollow sounds that were still present. This cable in our exhibit shows a cable that has paper insulation. Now, how do we get those cables onto the telephone poles? Well, you would actually use something called an insulator, which I have behind me here. These insulators were made out of glass, porcelain, or rubber, and they would sit on top of the telephone poles and hold the cables in place. These items are very precious to telephone collectors because of how beautiful they are. Just take a look at these ones. There are a variety of different colors that we have on display in our exhibit. In fact, even railroad buffs might find these pieces very interesting because insulators were a common sight along the railroad. Now, we have all of these pieces, but we need people to start putting it all together so that we can make our telephone calls, which is where new job opportunities started to pop up for us to be able to talk to each other on the phone. Let's check in with Katie to learn a bit more of these jobs.
Thanks, Emily. So now that we have a better understanding of how cables and phone lines actually work, let's talk a little bit about the people that actually looked after them. So line workers, they were people that essentially installed the poles, put the lines on the poles, and then maintained the maintenance to ensure that everything was working perfectly fine. And they're not a new job either. In fact, as early as the 1840s, when the telegraph was being used a lot more, well, that's where they got their first start. So when telephones became much more popular, it was much easier for these people to transition over into the telephone and electric lines than if you were just starting out. Being a line worker is actually kind of a dangerous job to get involved in. You're working on dead and live wires all the time, you're scaling these very tall poles and working very high up in various types of weather. In Elora in 1909, there was a crazy ice storm that really destroyed quite a few cables and poles were knocked over, and it was a prime example as to why being a line worker was so dangerous and oftentimes very frustrating. Between the 1890s and the 1930s, it was considered one of the most dangerous jobs to get involved in. 1 in 3 men were being electrocuted and dying because of this on a pretty regular basis. And it got so bad that a lot more organization was happening, so safety standards were brought up. So by the 1930s, an apprentice program was set into play so that these safety standards could be followed through with. To ensure you can do your job well and safely, tools are obviously necessary. So in those early years, between around 1870 to about 1900, line workers didn't really use that much. They had digging spoons, climbing spikes that went on their shoes, and they made their own climbing belts themselves. It would not be until around 1900 to about 1920 that workers actually wore rubber gloves regularly. Standardization of their belts and other equipment became more common as well around this time. Those modern bucket trucks that you see along the side of the road and about two-way radios, they were not first introduced until about 1951. But before we had modern bucket trucks, and even sometimes after that, workers would actually use cable carts. So as you can see in this image right here, this is Paul Axman actually using one of those cable cars, working on the lines like he would do on an everyday basis. And they're pretty simple to use, actually. It's just a piece of wood that's connected with some metal pieces, and they were used to essentially get to locations that were a little bit more difficult to get to. They were great because they allowed the line workers to actually sit down for long periods of time when they're out working in the field. And then it also allowed line workers to move up and down and give them mobility along the lines. So being a line worker was very dangerous, but it was a nice job if you wanted to be outside. And although it could be dangerous, a lot of the technology and safety standards that were developed in those early years are still used today. But not every position in the telephone industry was necessary as technology advanced. Enter our operators. So switchboard or telephone operators, they're essentially the bridge between you making your call and connecting to that person or business, whatever it is that it may be. And they have their own personal cables to actually do this. And it seems pretty straightforward, but the history of operators is actually kind of interesting. Generally, when we think of telephone operators, we have a picture in our brain from Hollywood films of women with their headsets on and heels on their feet on a line in the film, but that's not actually how it started. The very first recorded operator was a man by the name of George Willard Crowell, and he was hired in January of 1878. And frankly, all of the first operators were men. They were actually teenage boys. But the problem with this, they got a pretty bad reputation of being rambunctious, rude to customers, just overall not doing a really great job. Enter Emma Nutt. So she was the very first female operator to be hired in September of 1878. She was hired specifically by Alexander Graham Bell because he really enjoyed the sound of her voice, and he wholeheartedly tried to convince every other phone company out there to hire women and replace those teenage boys. And there were a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, the teenage boys, they just weren't working out. They were too rambunctious, they were too rude on the telephone. But if you focus in on those women, one of the big reasons was because socially at the time, they just assumed that women were a lot more courteous and kind on the telephone. But the main reason was because they were cheaper. You could pay women a lot less to do the same job as a man being an operator. For Emma Nutt, she would work 54 hours a week and get paid about $10 a month. So that's well under half of what her male counterparts would have been paid. So women may have been paid less to be operators, but they definitely flocked at the opportunity to get out of those factories and get a new job. But that doesn't mean that just because you're a woman, you're going to get the job. It could actually be kind of difficult. And that's because Emma Nutt was hired by Alexander Graham Bell because he liked the sound of her voice. He thought it was a very beautiful, very kind sounding voice. So because of that, every other woman was judged off of Emma's voice. So they actually had to go through an entire process of whether or not they had a kind sounding voice, whether or not they were poised. Some women even went through classes when they were hired to sound more poised over the telephone. And if you had an accent of any kind, it was less likely that you would actually get a job. And these women took a lot of pride in their work. They worked very, very hard. They worked very long hours, as Emma Nutt showed us with their 54 hours in a week. But unfortunately, when those dial phones were first introduced with their automatic switches and operators, their jobs became obsolete and they were replaced by an automatic operator instead. So our operators may have lost their jobs, but there are tons of positions in the telephone industry that have lasted from those very first years when those cables were first being put on those very tall poles. And I'm sure over the years, many more jobs will come and go as our technology advances. So I'd like to thank you for joining us on this crazy ride as we explore how these cables were actually made, who installed them, and how we actually got connected to our friends and family. So visit us at wellington.ca/museum to get more information, and we'll see you next time.